All right, so we have to move on now. At this point in time, Dr. Andrew Jarboe, author and historian, is joining us. And he's done doctoral work in history at the Northeastern University, where he studied modern world history, British India, and World War I as well. His 2021 book, Indian Soldiers in World War I, Race and Representation in an Imperial War, is a must read. Sir, appreciate you joining us. The first question is, why did you feel it was important to study the role of Indian Army in World War I?
Indian Army in World War I is important for a couple of reasons. And I think the first one worth stating up front is just simply this. World War I is India's war too. And in some ways, that is obvious to us. For example, we see that in the memorials to fallen Indian troops in France, like the memorial in Marseille that your Prime Minister is visiting. But it is also India's war in some ways that are less obvious to us, perhaps invisible to us, but were nonetheless real and important, and I think are worth investigating. I think the second thing then to say is that this topic matters for a simple, albeit significant reason. And that is that the story of the Indian Army in World War I is itself a reminder that the past is far more complicated than we sometimes allow. 1.5 million Indians served in the British-led Indian Army during World War I. More than 1 million of those soldiers deployed overseas to fronts all over the world, to France and to Belgium, to Macedonia and Gallipoli, to Egypt and East Africa, to Palestine and to what is now Iraq. And their contributions on the battlefield and beyond the battlefield mattered. They shaped and made that war.
Right. What can you tell us about the Indian Army? How significant were they in the battles, and why did the British rely so much on them?
One of the important things to remember is that at the beginning of the war in 1914, the Indian Army is Great Britain's only other professional fighting force. And so when the British Expeditionary Force deploys to Belgium and France in August of 1914, authorities in London are already scrambling to find more manpower, to find more troops. The Indian Army is what they've got. And so right from the outset, the Indian Army is mobilized and prepared for deployment. Troops board ships, and they start crossing oceans bound for destinations like Egypt or France or the Persian Gulf. The Indian Army is an all-volunteer professional fighting force organized in 1858 in the wake of the rebellion. And these are guys who are professional career soldiers. Most of them already have some experience in combat. And so the troops who arrive in France in October 1914, who are thrown into the trenches outside Ypres, these are soldiers who've seen combat before. This is not their first time in action. It is, like everybody else then fought on the Western Front, their first significant exposure to trenches and to machine guns and to all of the horrors of modern war. And they have to, just like everybody else, sort of figure it out on the fly, sort of make it up as they go along and figure out how to endure. Early years of the war, let's say 1914 and 1915, it might be appropriate to think of the Indian Army as like the fire brigade of the British Empire. Soldiers deployed to places to plug holes, to serve as a stopgap in order to secure important imperial holdings without which the British would have been unable to wage war. So Indian soldiers deployed to the Persian Gulf and to southern Iran to secure oil fields. They deployed to the Suez Canal because, quite frankly, how could the British wage a world war without access to the Suez Canal? And of course, they deployed to France because, for the simple fact that Britain needed men to stop the German onslaught. By the last years of the war, by 1917, by 1918, the Indian Army had evolved into an army of conquest. By 1917, 1918, the Indian Army is spearheading the conquest of the Middle East, of Mesopotamia, of Palestine. In late 1918, it is the Indian Army that finally defeats Ottoman Turkey and knocks the Ottomans out of the war. And so they served very important purposes in the war, and the purposes that the Indian Army served evolved as the war went on.
Well, right. Is there any specific story of a particular soldier that caught your eye or needed to be told to today's Indian audience?
I mean, let's begin just by saying that there are many stories that cannot be told. And they cannot be told because the people who might have told them did not make it home, because their letters to loved ones did not survive. But let us also acknowledge that there are many stories that were told. Soldiers did tell their stories. They did send letters home. And many of those letters, censored to be sure by their officers, many of those letters have survived. And so there is a rich archive of Indian voices from the trenches of France and Belgium in World War I. One story in particular stood out to me. I wrote about him in my book. His name is Mir Dust. He's a professional soldier serving in the Indian Army. He's been wearing the uniform since the 1890s. And he serves in one of the so-called frontier regiments, which are sort of like the elite infantry regiments of the Indian Army. He does not deploy to France in that first wave of troops who arrived in October 1914. He arrives a little bit later. But he is there in the thick of the action. And in April of 1915, he is there at the Battle of Ypres when the Germans deploy poison gas. And he swallows a lungful and has to go running for his life and choke and gasp for air desperately like anybody else because there were no gas masks yet. And then he went back into no man's land again, 8 more times, to collect wounded British and Indian officers and carry them out of harm's way, saving lives. For this gallantry, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. And he was awarded the Victoria Cross while in hospital in England in August of 1915. And here's what's fascinating about his story. The king himself, the king emperor, awarded Mir Dust that Victoria Cross and asked Mir Dust if there was anything he would like to request from his king. And Mir Dust said yes. And what he told the king was that he found it unfair that Indian soldiers who were wounded in battle were then sent back to fight after they recovered from their wounds. You see, soldiers like him who had been serving for the better part of 2 decades, they've served on campaign before. They've fought in battles before. And what they have come to expect from their previous experience is that if you are wounded on campaign, you get to go home because you have done your job. Well, all of a sudden, the British changed the rules. They changed the regulations. They changed the way things are done when these guys deploy to France. And it's not that they're disloyal, far from it. But they feel that once wounded, they have done their duty and they have earned the right to go home. And so he protests this to his king. He says, I think it is unfair and it's unjust that you send wounded men back to the trenches. And wouldn't you know it? Sometimes speaking to power like that works. He did not have to go back to the front. Many of his friends did not have to go back.
All right, so the Indian soldiers played a monumental role during World War I, serving on battlefields from France to Mesopotamia. In your research, what key contributions and sacrifices of these soldiers do you believe have been most overlooked in traditional historical narratives?
So Indian soldiers, they fought in France and Belgium. They fought in Macedonia and Gallipoli. They fought in Egypt. They fought in East Africa. They fought in Palestine, and they fought in Mesopotamia. Their contributions were many. Their sacrifices uncountable. but perhaps we can draw a few broad conclusions. And I think one thing to say is that the timely arrival of Indian infantry and cavalry on the Western Front in late 1914 very likely saved the British Expeditionary Force from annihilation. It's not altogether clear how the BEF might have held on without the arrival of those troops. I think related to that, the second thing worth saying is that Indian troops adapted to the trenches and to the horrors of industrial war as well as anybody else. And for a very long time, the historical narrative maintained that Indian soldiers were out of place on European battlefields. This was a racist trope that was in fact propagated during the war by those who were anxious about the deployment of South Asian soldiers to Western European battlefields, by those who worried that it might upend the empire's racial hierarchies. And for a very long time, the historical profession just regurgitated this racist stereotype that somehow deploying Indian troops to France was like loosing a tiger on an ice floe. That was sometimes the metaphor that was used. It's just false. It's just false. Indian troops adapted to the rigors of war in France as well as anybody else. And let us not forget, this is not to say that they did not complain about the rain and the cold and the mud. Of course they complained about these things. So did the French. So did the French. And in fact, we know from French trench newspapers that French soldiers complained more about the rain than they complained about German artillery. So let us forget this tired old narrative that says that Indian troops were somehow out of place, that they couldn't adapt to the cold in France. It's ridiculous. I think it's also important to say that Indian troops won the war against Turkey. The conquest of the Middle East was performed by the Indian Army. That was done mainly in 1917 and 1918. Now, there is another discussion here. 1 million Indian troops fought overseas. What did their service mean? That question itself was contested, was debated during the war.
Right. Also tell us, how were the Indian soldiers discriminated with, and if that's the case, why were they still motivated to fight for the British Empire?
As to the question of why did Indian soldiers fight, it is worth remembering that when the war began, the question in India was not, should we fight? The question was, will they let us fight? The British had a long history of excluding Indian troops from conflicts that pitted white troops against white troops. The most recent South African War, for example, from 1899 to 1902. The British Empire needed men there, but they worried about the optics and the outrage it might cause, the racist outrage it might cause, if they deployed Indian infantry to fight in that war. So the question at the start of the war was not, should we serve? The question was, will they let us serve? Well, why did people serve in the army? There are many reasons. One reason is because the army offered the avenue to one reason people served is because the army was a profession, and not an unrespected one at that. One could make a career out of being a soldier, and being a career soldier came with certain benefits, among them standing and stature at home. It's a job. It's a respected job. And so a lot of people served for that reason. Other people served because the army offered pay. It offered a pension. And you tended to find that recruiting numbers were higher among poorer populations than they were among more affluent or middle-class populations. The government of India during the war offered all sorts of lures to bring people into the ranks, signing bonuses, for example, land, for example. There were things to be gained by joining the army, and a lot of cash-strapped peasant families, especially those from Punjab, would send their sons off to the army because it supplemented the family income. It is also worth saying that by 1917 and 1918, when recruitment in India reached its most feverish pitch, a lot of the people who found themselves in uniform were coerced. They weren't what we might call free volunteers. And the government of India and army recruiters and propagandists and tax collectors and everybody else really did whatever they could to sort of turn the screws on people who resisted who resisted enlistment. And it's pretty fair to say that by the end of the war, a good many people who are in the army maybe themselves would not be in the army if it had truly been an all-volunteer force by the end of 1918. India never resorted to conscription during World War I, like, say, Britain did. But make no mistake that by the end of the war, young men are having their arms twisted. Once an Indian soldier was in the army, racist discrimination was part of it. It just came with the terrain. It was woven into the very fabric of the army. It was woven into the very fabric of the war. It was woven into the very fabric of British imperial rule. Indian soldiers were paid less than the white troops alongside whom they served alongside. An Indian officer could not command white troops. Indian troops had to have a white officer. An Indian soldier's body was policed in ways that a white soldier was not policed. So again, the British deployed Indian troops to France in 1914 and 1915 because they needed them there. They needed troops. But they were never really comfortable with what they called this experiment because they worried that it might undermine white prestige, right? So Indian bodies were policed and punished sometimes in ways and for things that white bodies were.
Well, do you think that has history given these Indian soldiers their due? If not, how do these visits, like the one being made by the Prime Minister, help in talking about these sacrifices?
The Prime Minister's visit, I think, is itself an important reminder that there's always more to the story, that there's more to this story, that there's more to the story of the war. And I think it is worth remembering that this was a big event. This was a complicated event, that it touched people, not just those who were in the actual fighting itself, but it touched people who were far away. And India left its imprint on this war. And in some ways, that imprint was plain to behold. The soldier in the trenches, speaking Punjabi, right? There's India. But in other ways, India's contributions to the war were not so obvious. Indian jute, for example, was exported from Bengal and manufactured into sandbags in Dundee, Scotland. And those sandbags saved lives in trenches in Belgium and France, right? India is everywhere in this war, in some ways that are obvious, in other ways that are not. The Prime Minister's visit, I think, is itself an important reminder that there's always more to the story, that there's more to this story, that there's more to the story of.
All right, finally, would the British have won this war if the Indian Army did not fight alongside them? Or do you think the Indian Army had a significant impact on the outcome?
It's certainly impossible to imagine the British waging the war that they waged without India and without India's contributions. The Indian Army won the war in the Middle East. Indian troops were not on the Western Front by 1918 to meet the onslaught of Germany's spring offensives that year. Could the British have won the war without India? Probably not, because the British rely on their empire to field the resources they need to win this war. But even Britain's empire was insufficient to meeting the demands of the war. It's impossible to imagine how the British could have held out without access to the resources of the United States of America, right? So they needed the empire, they needed the United States. India's contribution in men, in money, in food, in other raw materials dwarf the contributions of Britain's other colonies, of Britain's other dominions. For example, more Indian soldiers served than did soldiers from Britain's dominions, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and Canada combined.
All right, appreciate you joining us, sir. And I also would like to thank all our guests who were a part of this quite historic conversation. We take a break, be right back.